Good afternoon, my fellow carboholics. It's my day off and my day to experiment. So I thought I'd share a recipe that I like a lot with you. So follow along. This is the way you make your bread at home. You can make this bread easily at home yourself. I'm going to show you a few ways of kneading this dough that's a little bit different. And that's it. Let's get going. Okay, so we're looking at the formula or the recipe for today's bake. You don't have to write it down now. I'll have it popping up throughout the video, okay? So first thing we're going to do is start out with 907 grams of strong bread flour. Now there's a difference between bread flour and all-purpose flour and cake flour. Bread flour has about 14% gluten or protein. Then we're going to add 680 grams of water. I held a little bit back in order to have enough room in this cup. And 14 grams of sugar, 14 grams of yeast, and let that bloom. You don't have to do that if you're using SAF Gold instant yeast. You can mix it right into the dough or into the flour and you're good. Now the key here is not breaking the wall. And I broke the wall. But you know, that's all right. We can make up for that. We can recover. So all we have to do is push this water back into our dough and continue with the mix. This is the water I held over. I had left over. Couldn't get in the measuring cup. And I'm going to add this slowly and combine the dough with the flour. Now here is what we're trying to accomplish here. We're trying to get all of this flour hydrated. We're not trying to develop any gluten or anything other than that. We just really want a shaggy mass. Everything that is flour has to get wet. And we're almost there. And you can already tell how this dough is coming together. It's a very sticky dough. So, you know, the secret to sticky dough is working with wet hands. And I obviously haven't figured that out here yet. But we're almost hydrated. We're almost at the point where we're going to let it rest for just a little bit. Now, this is going to be our first sort of bench rest. It's actually called an autolyse. It is where we allow the flour to absorb as much of that water as it possibly can. So let's rest it covered for 15 minutes. Come back to it and we'll tell you, we'll take a look at what it looks like. So it's been 15 minutes and already you can see how much difference has been made. Look at the formation of gluten already here. You can look at the extensibility of this dough. That's amazing. And you know, we haven't even added salt and the oil yet. So I'm going to add the 14 grams of salt right here and a tablespoon of extra virgin olive oil. That will help me to actually help this salt penetrate the dough and become evenly dispersed. Now, whenever you add fat to a dough that has already begun to develop some of its gluten structure, it'll feel like it's coming apart. It'll look like it's coming apart. And you'll sit there and you'll knead and you'll think, oh my God, what have I done wrong? Am I ever going to get this back to where it was, you know, what it looked like before? Can I recover? Yes, you can. And this is what's supposed to happen. So you knead away, continue to knead. This is building up the strength of the dough. And already you can see it coming back to where it was. Now, because this is such a wet dough, I'm going to use this French method called the slap and fold. And you slap the dough down and you flip it back upon itself. Slap it down and flip it back on itself. And that does a couple of things. It strengthens the gluten and it also traps air. So we want to knead this dough until it's smooth and elastic. And you'll easily be able to tell when that happens, and it'll become less likely to stick to your fingers. And if it does start to stick to your fingers, just wet your hands. That's the key here. You're going to have to do this for, 15 minutes. I always say about 700 slaps, but it's not that many. 15 minutes should do it. Some people are stronger than others. Some people are more accomplished than others. And you don't have to do the slap and fold. This certainly can be done in a stand mixer, except you won't know what's going on with the dough. It's important, I think, particularly if you're new to baking, is to do things by hand so you can feel what's going on in the dough. And the dough will always tell you what it needs. And in order for you to really learn how dough behaves, you got to have your hands in it. So we're at the place where we're smooth. I want the dough to relax a little bit before I start my first stretch and fold. And it's relaxed on me now. I'm going to stretch it and fold it. We do this in place of all that extra kneading. I want to trap some air and have it begin the bulk fermentation. We're going to do a 2-hour cold bulk fermentation. So I make a little raggedy ball out of the dough, tighten it up just a little bit. You don't need to be as anal as I am about it here. You just want just a little ball. And you want to cover that and let that rest for 30 minutes. Now, as hot as it is in South Carolina, we're not looking for a real warm place to put this because I don't want to over ferment it. However, I do want it to be in a draft-free environment. So this little case works out perfectly for me. I've made more dough in that thing than I care to think about. Now here it is 30 minutes later, and we're going to do our second stretch and fold. Start at one end and lift up. You don't want to tear the dough, but you do want to stretch it. And fold it over, 90-degree turn, stretch it, fold it over. Same thing, and one last time, stretch it and fold it over. It'll get stiffer every time. Now we turn it upside down, put it back in its case. 30 minutes from now, we'll do that one more time, and then we'll do the cold bulk fermentation. So I cut all that out. We just took it out of the refrigerator. It's actually been out for about an hour so that it can come back to room temperature. I'm going to release the dough a little bit from the sides of the bowl and just dump it out, trying not to degas it so much. Now the top of the dough is on the board. It doesn't matter so much that flour is on that top part because that won't be incorporated back into the dough. The part that's on the board right now is the good surface. That's the one we're going to use on the outside of the bread. So we're going to fold it up. In this case, we're going to make a boule, create just a little bit of tension, and in this case, we're making a batard. So we shape the loaf. This is pre-shaping. We loosely shape the loaf into the desired shape and let it rest. And I always like to think that the dough is learning how to become what I want it to be in that pre-shape. Now in this stage, this is called the final shaping. This is where we're going to introduce tension. So we're going to fold the dough a little bit more and knock back some of the air out of this thing, particularly the large air bubbles, and shape it with a lot of tension across that surface. And you see me here flouring this banneton. Listen, if you need to flour it with whatever you feel comfortable with, some semolina, some rice flour, mixed with your flour. The last thing you want to have happen is a wet dough like this to stick to your banneton. It will ruin your day. Now these bannetons typically come with a cloth. It can be a cover, or it can, go inside the banneton. You just stick this on that cloth. I don't. I like to stick it right into the banneton. I like the way that the rattan makes marks on my bread. I had a brain fart there for a minute. All right, now that they're in the bannetons, we're going to cover them and let them rise for an hour. Take a floured finger and you can push down on the dough, and if it goes in and stays in, maybe pops back just a little bit, you're right on the numbers. That's when the bread has been proofed sufficiently. Now, parchment paper here is your friend. not the non-greased version, because that'll stick. This version this is a Reynolds product. It's a parchment paper pop-up. My goodness, this thing, I go through so much of this. I need to buy stock in this store, in that product. So here you see me scoring the dough. This is to do two things. It will mark the dough as, who the baker was. It shows who the baker was. It helps me identify who the client is. I mean, it can have a lot of different communication purposes, but it also helps me to determine where I want this dough to expand. When it hits that hot pot or it hits that hot pizza stone, it's going to have what we call is oven spring. It's going to jump up a little bit. And if you don't score it, tell it where you want it to break, it's going to find the weakest point, and that's where it's going to split, and you'll have a not so very attractive piece of bread. Still edible, but what we're trying to get away from. So my ovens are preheated with my stones, and in this case my Dutch ovens, to 500 degrees, and an additional 500 degrees, preheat it for an additional 30 minutes to make sure everything is really up to temperature. We're going to bake these off for 24 minutes, but there are some crucial ways to determine if it's done. Listen to the little crackling sound that you might hear from the surface. You're going to tap the bottom. It should sound hollow like a drum. But for me, the most important thing to do is to check the temperature. And I want that temperature to be between 197 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Cool them on a wire rack, and Bob's your uncle. So I couldn't find my bread knife, so I've got a watermelon knife, and that seems to work just perfectly. It's been about 2 hours. I've let this cool sufficiently, or as long as I plan to let it cool. And I can't tell you, man, what this smell is like in this room. This is beautiful, beautiful aromatic bread. And it's extremely soft. And you saw that the crumb was, not a big open crumb like a sourdough bread. But this is so aromatic and soft. It's amazing. So let's put some butter on it and see what some additional heat will do to it. Look at that. Now that's a piece of toast. A buddy of mine, Scott Derrick, owns Blythewood Beekeeping Association right around the corner. And this is honey from his shop. Doesn't get much better than that. To see more of us, find us on Snapface, InstaChat, and Facegram. Just like us and subscribe.